Thank you, Jim. Thank you very much. And I also thank, with my list here, I need prompting the green matter starts going dark after you hit a certain age, which I will not divulge. I want to thank Susie Birchback, Kiki Herbert, Mike Skinner, the Grosse Pointe Historical Society for their help. It's been very valuable in this research. The charter members of the Fairview Historical Society, which is a 501(c) nonprofit organization, specifically so that I can bridge the gap between what is now a part of Detroit and what became Grosse Pointe Park. There's a void in the middle, and I'm going to fill that void. So we have Ron Mikulak, Ron will be helping me. We do have John Sanderson, Sue Steinhauer, and Professor Stephen Roble, who later on will give you a graphic depiction of what this racetrack that Henry Ford raced on actually looked like. We're going to go inside of it for the first time in 100 years. So it's going to be very exciting. Winston Churchill said, the longer you look back, the farther you can look forward. And in the presentation here, we're going to take a look at what happened 100 years ago. I don't think there are anyone here this evening that can remember 100 years ago. Am I right or wrong? No one will dare say, huh? 100 years ago, this area was quite different. And even going back to 1701, at the founding of Detroit, we had names like Cadillac, Campo, Chauvin, Moran, Reno, Trombley, and Rayoon. Gene Tamblin's grandfather has a direct connection to the manifest of the people that landed with Cadillac in Detroit. So we have a celebrity here, one among many tonight. These names are very influential names because they left their mark in this area, all over, right, Stuart? In 1712, a major incident occurred, but the epicenter of that incident involving the French and the Sac-Fox Indian Nation occurred west of the lighthouse, so noted by Clarence Burton in his documentation of this incident. West of the lighthouse, if you're familiar with Windmill Point, puts it in Detroit. That's where that incident took place, and that ground contains the remains, so documented by Clarence Burton, of 1,000 Indians, which makes the ground sacred ground. That marker is at Lake Point and Windmill Point Drive, identifying historically that this incident took place. It was a decimation of the Fox tribe. The French liquidated those people. Some have remained, and they are now in Oklahoma. They have a reservation in Oklahoma. They are just as much detached with the history that occurred here as probably any one of us in this room this evening. In 1796, the United States took over this area of the Grand Marais. They took over Detroit in 1796. Believe that or not, the Revolutionary War actually ended here in July of 1796, right, Mike? Pretty close. We have names. Alexander Grant, who's considered the father of Grosse Pointe. Alexander Grant. Charles Chauvin, George, Charles, and William Moran. The Morans were cousins. Charles and William were cousins, but they're very significant at what happened in the area. This was the Grand Marais. Is anyone French in here? Do we have anyone that knows the lingua franca of what Grand Marais means, what it translates into?
Great swamp.
Great swamp. Big muck. That's what it was, all mud. It was all mud. And the area pretty much stayed that way for quite a while until the Morans discovered clay. They found clay in soundings. They were funded by the United States government to find a way to drain this area and reclaim it so that they could use it to build on it. Everywhere else there were strip farms, except in the Grand Marais. You can't do anything with mud. We have this huge area, 900 acres, stretching from Bewick in Detroit and coming all over to the Kedger Road. 900 acres. In 1822, the Township of Hamtramck was established. Now, Hamtramck then is not the Hamtramck of today. Hamtramck then was huge. We had a huge swatch of land. Can you help me on that? This is Hamtramck Township. This huge swatch right here. And that would take in what is now Harper Woods, and may have even abutted what is now East Point. And here's the Detroit limit right here at Mont Elliott. That was the city limit of Detroit. Everything else belonged to Hamtramck. In 1848, Grosse Pointe Township was created out of Hamtramck Township. So for a long while, the jurisdiction of the area had its own identity, and the identity was Hamtramck. In the 1890s, Detroit started out on its manifest destiny of expansion. Any way it would grab area. And even if it came at the expense of the townships that were surrounding it, Greenfield Township, which would take in Dearborn, or going out towards the Southfield area. You had Springwells Township, going to the Downriver area, Delray, all these areas. They had an independence. They had their own identity. But Detroit needed stretching space. So at the expense of Hamtramck Township, Detroit starts taking up land. And in 1873, during the Hugh Moffett administration, they went for the Grand Marais. They decided to take a land grab. The Michigan Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. You can't encroach upon an area that has its own identity and its own sovereignty. You cannot do that. So the United States Supreme Court turned back the city of Detroit. It happened once again in 1885 under the Grumman administration. They did the same thing. Michigan Supreme Court comes back, says, matter-of-factly, you cannot encroach upon a sovereign entity. You can't do this. So again, Detroit was turned back. In July of 1894, and I'm going to touch on this, but Professor Roble is going to show you more about the racetrack. On July 17th of 1894, the Grosse Pointe Racecourse opened its inaugural run. What is significant about this racetrack? Well, it's the successor of the Hamtramck racetrack that existed in what is now Indian Village. There was a racetrack there between Van Dyke and Fisher, from St. Paul down to the water. That was the Hamtramck racetrack. Its inaugural run was in 1853, although races were conducted there well before that in the 1830s. Kind of informally, it organized itself as the Hamtramck track in 1853. That was the inaugural run. Primary investors, the Owens family, the Owens Cook Farm, which existed in the area, and the Campbell family. In fact, the first horse that won was called Billy Campbell. That was the horse that won the inaugural run at Hamtramck. The significance about this particular racetrack in 1894 is that it was owned by Daniel J. Campo Jr. That was his property, right there, south of Jefferson Avenue, between Connor, over to Lennox, down to what is now Essex. 90 acres owned by Daniel J. Campo, who inherited it from his uncle, A.M. Campo, Alexander McComb Campo. That was the Campo farm. In fact, north of Jefferson was another Campo farm where the Daimler plant is. That was all Campo property too. The Campos were very wealthy. Campos were probably the wealthiest family in Michigan in that period of time. We have another community, and I want to touch on this too because it's significant. It's part of Grosse Pointe's history. St. Clair Heights. It was organized in 1896, Bewick at Mack, north to Harper, east to Connor. The trustees on that incorporation, George Hendry, who was mentioned earlier, and a gentleman named Eugene Sloman. They ran St. Clair Heights. Unincorporated. That's significant. It was unincorporated. The Detroit Jockey Club, which is a second racetrack that existed in the area. Again, I'm touching on it, but more detail later on. In 1893, capitalized at $100,000 in 1893 money, which is a lot of money. Hiram Walker was one of the signers on that. Of course, we know what he did. He liked to give everybody a good spirit now and then. So that racetrack, we have two racetracks now in the area. Now I have the area, the whole room area here is surrounded with pictures, and I believe in the old adage, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And the graphics are good, the editorial cartoons are good, because they will give you a flavor of what existed during that period of time. They're very eloquent, they speak of themselves. You have pictures of Mr. Ford, and I believe it's Albert Shanks, am I right? The engineer who was on the running board. We have a picture of Mr. Ford and Barney Oldfield at the racetrack that we will be seeing a little later. So the entranceway at Algonquin. The little vestige that you see at Algonquin, that little, it looks like a separation, that's where the gate existed as you went into the racetrack. They left that little vestige for future generations to ponder like an obelisk. Why? You know? This is it right here. That's that little vestige right here. You had little places, roadhouses. You had Snug Harbor, which offered you a little libation. You had the Garska House, which is still there on Jefferson Avenue. Blossom Heath, which ties into this because that's Matt Kramer, and he ties into Macomb County very nicely. So as I move along here, you're going to see how counties kind of fold into each other here. We have the Grosse Pointe House. So people like to have fun back then. They didn't need television or radio or iPods or God knows what else to invade your privacy. Here's the significant date in the birth of Fairview. House Bill 1100 was introduced in the state legislature February 23rd of 1903. Now, who did the introduction of this House Bill, do you think? Somebody from our area? Some notable, do you think? Anybody have a guess? Dr. John Seymour Doheny. His descendant is now a treasurer in Oakland County, Mr. Doheny. Mr. Doheny was a physician by trade in Greenfield Township. He lived in Greenfield Township. What in God's name does Greenfield Township have to do with us? Mr. Doheny had the dubious distinction of being the only Democrat in the state legislature that year. The executive branch was controlled by the Republican Party. Both branches of the legislature were controlled by the Republican Party. Mr. Doheny is a Democrat. So what? The man who ran the Democratic Party in Michigan was Daniel Joseph Campo Jr. You do what Mr. Campo says. Mr. Campo mandated, Mr. Doheny, I want you to introduce this bill in the state legislature. And so it happened. On April 4th of 1903, prominent businessmen in the area got together and said, we want this community to exist where the Grand Marais exists. And they thought it was laughable. You want to put what? Where? Well, one of the distinctive men happened to be Joseph Berry. That's Berry Brother Paints. Mr. Berry was very prominent and very moneyed and very powerful. So Mr. Berry, along with Messrs. Bewick, Potter, Judge Henry Swan, Walter Russell, Henry Stevens, Alexander M. Campo, W.C. McMillan, it's like a who's who, isn't it? Senator Russell Alger, his house, okay. H.B. Baldwin, John Dwyer, Louis Clays, who owned a bar. That was the most important guy. Adolphus Pay, Charles Pay, they want Fairview to exist because they want to put a road right through it to connect Grosse Pointe Farms to Detroit. Now, who's going to pay for the road? If there's no community there, who's going to fund it? Detroit? It's not part of Detroit. Wayne County? Why? Well, we got to take care of that. So, May 28th of 1903, Governor Aaron Bliss approves Local Act 501, which allows for the incorporation of the Village of Fairview. Voila, it's done. And they saw that was good. The Village of Fairview, within the Township of Grosse Pointe. June 15th, the Village of Fairview conducts its first election. Articles of incorporation are signed by Daniel Joseph Campo Jr., Matthew Kramer, who owns a bar. We have Thomas William Corby, and that name's important too. Thomas William Corby. And we have Louis Plays. They signed the Articles of Incorporation. Where? At the home of Peter Defer. And Mr. Defer lives a block over from St. Jean and Jefferson, where it's a mound now, and it says Defer on the street. That's where Mr. Defer lived. He was the postmaster of the Chauvin Post Office in Grosse Pointe Township. Chauvin, because Mr. Chauvin used to live where the waterworks is. He was an old guy that left his doors open, and he died a mysterious death. To this day, this is a case for CSI. They don't know how he died. Although the attorney that adjudicated the estate for Mr. Chauvin was Alexander Grossbeck. Wow. Who? Grossbeck? Really? For real? Yeah, the first corporate lawyer for the Village of Fairview. This is the first job that Mr. Grossbeck had outside his law practice. Corporate attorney for the Village of Fairview. Alexander Grossbeck. That name's coming back to us later on. Fairview is 7 square miles. Bewick to the west, Cadgy to the east. It's Goethe, not Gothic. Anybody know anything about Goethe? Who? Yes, sir. German poet. There was a strong German ethnicity in the area at that day. Also Schiller, because there's a street named Schiller, and there was a club called the Schiller Club, and there's a bust of Schiller. Actually, maybe it's a full statue on Belle Isle. That's Schiller. There were also Masons, but I'm not going there yet. Fairview was named in deference to the homestead of William Jennings Bryan, who came from Fairview, Nebraska. The guy ran 3 times for President of the United States, lost 3 times, Cross of Gold speech, Social Security, everything else under the sun, way ahead of his time. So we're going to name this community for William Jennings Bryan, right? Yeah. On the face of it, not really. There's another municipality that has a stronger connection to this area. That's Fairview, Tennessee. Why? Fairview, Tennessee is noted for thoroughbred horses. Pre-Civil War, Andy Jackson had thoroughbred horses. The Hermitage. This location is the namesake for Fairview because of the horse culture. George Henry had a farm there. William K. Vanderbilt had a farm there. Vanderbilt University. And so did Mr. Campo. So on the face of it, it seems like a tip of the hat to William Jennings Bryan because we like this guy. Not. I like the graphics because you get a good picture. It says Fairview there, Fairview, Tennessee. Fairview at the time had an ethnic mix of Belgian, French, German, Irish, and Scotch. And in St. Clair Heights, almost less than 1% was African American by the 1910 census in St. Clair Heights. Population is roughly 1,105. And that population I gathered from the Water Board because it missed the census of 1900. Next census is 1910. So this census is right in the middle, but it's the water department that came up with those figures. So we have 1,105 people who are living technically in an area of mud. The township of 1900 consists of 2,933, the entire township. of Grosse Pointe. Grosse Pointe Farms had a population in 1893 at its incorporation of 615. Grosse Pointe Village, which is now the city of Grosse Pointe, had a population of 417. So the bulk of the population is now in this new entity called Fairview. A lot of people. 2 schools. In fact, the oldest school in the area was called the Lilybridge School at Kirchhoff at St. Jean. That's still there. That was part of Grosse Pointe fraction of the school system number 10. Number 10. That building is still there. The post office is at St. Jean and Jefferson. The law enforcement is taken care of by the township, but it had a constable. There was 1 constable for Fairview. The village hall is located at Jefferson between Lakeview and Rush. Rush is now called East Lawn. That's where the village hall was located. And by the way, they did get the paving bill. That money came from the township, but after a fight, it had to be done in court. Fairview got the money. The paved road between Veneto and Cadieux, I believe, is the second paved road in the state, or the city area. This first was Woodward. So this section was paved by Thomas Campo and Son. So we talk about nepotism a little bit. In 1904, the city of Detroit makes an accusation that Fairview is discharging raw sewage into the river via Conner Creek. They're afraid of typhoid. This is the specter. We're going to get typhoid. They're dumping sewage. Bird flu. We're going to get bird flu. We're going to get, God's going to strike us down. Oh! Typhoid Mary became big in Chicago in 1906. There was no typhoid here. It's a pretense by the city of Detroit, but a nice legal maneuver. If we can scare everybody, then we'll get people to say, Detroit's going to protect you. We will. Fairview responds by selling property to Detroit at Conner and Jefferson for a pumping station to control the discharge. The station is still there. Fairview responded. Detroit put an injunction on Fairview. Now they had to take it off. There was no legal reason to keep it. But we have another boogeyman that's lurking in the corner. Ken, I'm sorry to go there, but it's Detroit United Rail. Yeah, Detroit United Rail. This is an amalgamation of a lot of independent streetcar companies that formed in 1900 and created Detroit United Rail. Jerry Hutchins was the CEO, am I correct? And Frank Brooks was the guy underneath him. We have streets named for Brooks. Brooks is named for Frank Brooks. I got another street for you. Halley. The Halley Ordinance, City of Detroit. Halley was an attorney for the City of Detroit. PJM Hammond. DUR, Detroit United Rail. And what is so interesting about Detroit United Rail? Well, they were represented on the street by a guy named Robert Oakman. Does that name sound familiar to anybody? Robert Oakman? Ran the Republican Party for a while. Came out of Hayes and Pingree's administration. So did a guy named William Thompson. These guys were muscle, especially Oakman. There's a story about Bob Oakman and John and Horace Dodge. They were in a bar. And the Dodge boys liked to drink a little bit. And an attorney came in there who was confined to a wheelchair. So the story goes, Mr. Oakman and the Dodge brothers picked on this guy. And unfortunately, this guy didn't know how to get out of there fast enough because of the situation. And he became a victim of Oakman and John and Horace. Well, they apologized, and they settled out of court and everything. But nonetheless, this is the social mix of the day. Robert Oakman was a powerful man. William Hilger, Hilger Street. William Hilger was on the Detroit City Council along with a guy named Edward Cordy. Hilger and Cordy were involved in real estate speculation. Mr. Hilger was the face on the street for Mr. Berry. So he bought property up from Mr. Berry's, let's say, his not-so-friendly friends. And he bought the property without them really knowing that it was going to Mr. Berry. Okay? So we got a lot of shenanigans going on. DJ Campo controls the village trustees, but has problems with his racetrack. In 1906, and Susie puts this in her book, that the racetrack ceased operations in 1905. Where's Susie? Susie here? Back here? Okay, that's true. That's true. They ceased in 1905, but the 1906 season was suspended due to problems that Mr. Campo had with bookies from St. Louis. So the season shut down. Came back in 1907, and from 1907 to 1911 was dedicated exclusively to horses. No more cars. And we'll get to that when we get to Stephen's portion. How am I doing on time? Are we doing good? Okay. This is a ticket that the People's Party ticket of the Village of Fairview ran. You see Mr. Campo here. We have John Garska, who was running for political office as well. Detroit lifted their injunction against Fairview on the sewage. Okay, they had no plaintiff. Fairview wins their case against Grosse Pointe Township over the paving. Hey, Fairview's on a roll. Campo's problems with the racetrack ends with the suspended season for 1906. Now, in 1906, we get a mysterious petition signed by 300 people who want Fairview annexed to Detroit. Who are these people? And went to the state legislature. In my research, in trying to find this in Lansing, they don't know what I'm talking about. It doesn't exist. It never existed. But Robert Oakman was the guy that came up with this idea of having a petition. Because petitions can't be ignored. Power of the people. By the people, for the people. Only if it's true. In 1907, the mayor of Detroit, William Barnum Thompson, by trade his family, they were in the butcher business. They were butchers. I got a picture of Mr. Thompson back there. He's got a meat cleaver hanging from his waist. Now, that can mean a couple things. But the most important thing is that Mr. Thompson came out of the Pingree administration. He was also a city treasurer. Meat cleaver. Okay? You see the prime cuts? And he cuts them. He's aggressive, though. He wants Fairview. And he's bound and determined to get Fairview, no matter what. He's going to get it. When Thompson approaches the governor, Governor Warner, Warner says that there's no reason for you to do this. You can't. It's incorporated. It's a municipality. You can't do this. Thompson says, I'll go to the Michigan Supreme Court and lodge a protest that this area should become part of Detroit. All of it in its entirety. That means the 7 square miles of Fairview get absorbed into Detroit, including what's now Grosse Pointe Park. The Michigan Supreme Court says, what? No. You can't do it. Thompson sends a special emissary to Lansing to argue in front of the state legislature. Now, there are friendly ears to this. William Dust, who was a state representative of what was then called the 17th Legislative District, around Belle Isle and thereabouts. And these guys are going to push for the annexation. They're going to move on it. Governor Warner has a special session of the state legislature for Christmas holidays in 1907. Do you know how difficult that is? Or the Christmas holidays? In one day, my friends, in one day, the bill is introduced. It's argued. And by executive decree, Fairview's gone. Fairview's gone. How did that happen? Golly. Well, the DUR, once again, Mr. Warner has special perks from Detroit United Rail out in his homestead of Farmington. He was in the cheese business. He made milk and cheese. So the DUR said they would give him special perks by putting a sign in the car to help him out there. So the governor, you never look a gift horse in the mouth, so to speak. And Governor Warner was very sympathetic to that. Signed off on Fairview. House Enrolled Act 185, Village of Grosse Pointe Park is created. Now, technically speaking, Fairview is still alive. So the window of opportunity to form Grosse Pointe Park comes into play. Now, one of the movers and shakers behind this is Mr. George Hendry. He wants to see this portion of Fairview saved from Detroit. And they do it. They do it. On June 7th of 1907, Thomas W. Corby, a signee on the incorporation of Fairview, is elected as the first village president of Grosse Pointe Park. Thomas William Corby. His brother was William Corby, chaplain in the Union Army during the Civil War. His father was one of the co-founders of Mount Eliot Cemetery, Daniel Corby, with Robert Eliot and Thomas Gallagher. The Corby name funded 8 Catholic parishes in the area. Mr. Corby, at his death in 1924, was worth $4 million in 1924. Mr. Corby was responsible for starting a seawall in the area to protect the area from flooding. He had a brickyard where I think it's the Parcell School at Somerset, right?
No,
Pierce School. That was his brickyard. So he's in the brick business. Mr. Corby was a very influential man. However, he ran afoul of the Catholic Church. Some of us do. And he didn't get a Catholic funeral. His property was between Kensington and 3 Mile, from Mack to Jefferson. St. Clair de Montefalco Church sits on the Corby farm at its northern extreme. That was Corby's property. He died in 1924 when St. Clair de Montefalco built their church in 1926. How was it probated? One of the questions on this. Very interesting. On October 22nd of 1907, before the full bench of the Michigan Supreme Court, Moore, representing the Village of Fairview, Daniel J. Campo of counsel versus Timothy Tarzan for the city of Detroit. This is the final episode after I spill my water. Michigan Supreme Court upholds legislative and governing order to have Detroit annex that portion of the Village of Fairview from deed to alt, published in the Detroit Legal News of 1927. They amended that. They struck the deal. They allowed Grosse Pointe Park to exist. Fairview is gone. We have more of the graphics of the day. The brick at Marlboro. How do you explain a brick street in the 1890s? That's right. And why? What was it used primarily as for access to the track? You've touched on it. You're absolutely right. To support the rails for the streetcar spur coming from Essex north to Jefferson to carry people into the racetrack from the Detroit Jockey Club. Okay? Excellent. This is Dr. Doheny. After his bit of fame for introducing the legislation to start Fairview, he dropped off the radar screen, never to be heard from again. But his siblings were around. The Doheny brothers were around in the legal profession for some time after. Joseph Barry, who died under mysterious circumstances just before Fairview's demise, in a traffic mishap, no less, then, in 1907. That was significant. D.J. Campo, George Hendry, Eugene Sloman. We have George Defer. We have a school named for George Defer, the Defer family, the property on Jefferson at St. Jean. We also have a street in St. Clair Shores named for the same family. Very, very significant. These are all the people that... I talked too much. Steve, you ready?
Keep going.
I don't smoke either. So much for the smoking hobby. Or not smoking hobby. This is Windmill Point. This is Clinks Inn. A trailer park took that area over. It's also involved in the incident with the Fox Indians. So that's where we're right down here. Billy Clink was in the bar business. He went out of business in 1916 because Prohibition started here in 1916. Couldn't sell booze anymore. The Thomas Motor Car Company was established at Clairpoint and Froude in 1906, while the area was still Fairview. What's the significance about that factory? The Thomas Motor Car Company. The factory building itself. Anybody know? Anybody hazard a guess? Pardon me? Well, in the sense of who actually designed the edifice? Who designed that building? Anybody want to take a guess? Albert Kahn. That was the second plant that Albert Kahn designed. The first was the Packard facility. Thank you, Mike. See, people love me.
We all love you.
Thank you. Oh, I said celebrities in the audience. Ann Politzer. Ann, would you stand up, please? Ann's descended from the Trombley family. The original name of Connor Creek was Trombley Creek. Her family goes back a long way, just like Jeannie's. Albert Kahn designed the plant. It became the Thomas Motor Car Company. Thomas Motor Car Company became Chalmers. Chalmers became Chrysler. Chrysler became Daimler. Everest to tinker to chance, man. All right. But it's not only the Thomas Motor Car Company. We had Hupp. We had Lozier. We had Columbia. We had Liberty. We had Bud. All in the area of Fairview. The automobile business started here. Mike, we're going to see that race. It started in our neck of the woods. And I pay no disrespect, Bob, to Milwaukee Junction. I pay no disrespect. It started here. If it didn't start here, it wouldn't have started anywhere. This is Fairview's claim. It's Grosse Pointe Park's heritage, and more Grosse Pointe Parks than it is Detroit. We got lines of blood that connect here. We have Jacques Campo. Jacques was, they don't have his picture there because he's, I think, on America's Most Wanted. But Jacques landed with Cadillac. His father was Etienne, Stephen, from France. So Jacques came to Montreal, and Jacques' name isn't on the manifest downtown. I don't know why. But he came here with Monsieur Cadillac. I hope I said that right. I even took French in college. I did. But the Campo name, you don't see it anywhere anymore. 143 Lakeshore, the parish house for St. Paul on the Lake, is the house that Daniel J. Campo died in 1927. He bought that house from a guy named Burns Henry. Burns Henry was in the horse business. So was Mr. Campo. Mr. Campo was an interesting guy. He was a bachelor all of his life. The clock is still ticking for me. When Campo was 75 years old, he married a lady named Catherine DeMille Moore. That was her married name. That was his law partner, George Moore, George William Moore. She divorced her husband to marry DJ. They were Episcopalians.
Part of this project. I've worked for the last year. How's that? Okay. I'm not actually. So anyway, I worked with 2 students on this, and I'm running it back and continue the presentation from there. Okay, can you still hear me? Okay. Our mission was to recreate the Detroit Driving Club as it existed on October 10th, 1901. This was the site of a race between Henry Ford and Alexander Winton. Winton was the favorite. He was a very well-known race car driver. He was a winner. Ford was a mechanic from the Detroit area. Ford won. That gave Ford the credibility to begin his motor car company. So, in many ways, this racetrack was the birth of the Motor City. The racetrack was located on Jefferson Avenue, right where Algonquin Street is now. It extended all the way to the Detroit River. This is a modern map with my model of the racetrack on top of it. You can see that the waterfront has been, the shoreline has been moved out considerably since 1901. You're seeing the Detroit Jockey Club in the background there. I put that in there because many people confuse the two. A lot of people believe that the race was held at the Detroit Jockey Club instead of the Detroit Driving Club. Right at the top of the screen there, that's where the Jefferson Avenue plant is now. And you'll see a little bit of Belle Isle go by. Just to give you a sense of where it is. It's interesting to note that Dickerson Street today follows the curve of the track on what's the opposite of the clubhouse there? The other side of the track. Riverside. The racetrack was about 80 acres, the site was about 80 acres, which makes it about 3/4 of a mile long by 1/4 of a mile wide, roughly. This was built at a scale of accuracy down to 1 inch. This is a flyover of the racetrack. You know, my screen, I can't get the monitor to be smaller than it is, so I hope you can see that clearly. There was a brick paved boulevard from Jefferson Avenue all the way to the river. There was a streetcar line next to that. It was a 1 mile oval track with a clay surface. It would accept steamboat ferries. There was a dock at the Detroit River end. The writings at the time commemorate the park or mention the park-like setting of the racecourse. So we tried to capture that in our model. The ponds that you see were there to help control the moisture in the surface of the track. So they could pump water in and out of the ponds to keep the track at the right consistency. The track was originally built with 13 stables and later expanded to 17. This is Jefferson Avenue. The track is on the left side. You can see the barns there. Jefferson Avenue was divided in those days. It was a divided highway. We know it was paved. I don't know how much, or I don't know how it was paved, if it was concrete or brick. But you can see the stables on the left there. There are streetcar lines running on both sides of the street. All of the traffic was horse-drawn, of course, except for the streetcars, which were electric. Horse-drawn. Coming up on the left is the secretary's house to the track. This presumably was the home of Daniel Temple. And turning into the track, there's the paved driveway. There's the picturesque arch, as it was called.
Yeah, let's keep it quiet.
And coming down the entryway into the park. The park did have a streetcar access. It actually had a streetcar station. We have found maps of the streetcar line, so this was as accurate as I could make it. There was a pedestrian bridge that led from the streetcar station over the entryway into the track area. I had speculated on the building. I imagine there was some sort of shelter for passengers, but I don't know exactly what it was. And they had quite an extensive siding, so I imagine that the cars would be gathered so that when the race was over, they would be there to shuffle people back home. There was a clubhouse, which, writing at the time, there were Michigan Horseman magazine ran an article about the track, and specifically mentioned the clubhouse as one of its features. The clubhouse had a two-story veranda all around it. It had a cupola, a tower, and they comment on the view of the lake from there. It had dining rooms in it, and as well as other sorts of refreshment facilities. I don't know if they served booze or not. The third floor had living quarters, so that people could overnight there. The clubhouse was open year-round, even though the harness racing season was not year-round. I know that there was a driveway for access, and I've speculated on the shape of it. I just assumed it was brick since the other paving in the racetrack was brick. There was also a stable for members of the club to stable their horses, but I left that out. The barn area was considered quite innovative at the time because it was not simply a shed, but it was a series of box stalls. Each horse had a 12 by 12 foot stall. They could do 20 to 24 horses per barn. So that gave me an idea of how big the stables were. They also comment on the wide spacing between the stables, so the horses could be walked to cool down after their race. So I deliberately incorporated that into the reconstruction. Detroit Driving Club, by the way, was a harness racing club, so they called it the Driving Club. The Jockey Club was down the road. They rode the horses. This is a scene of the race. There's one photograph that exists of the race, and I tried to capture that. The car with the yellow wheels is Whitney's car. The car with the red wheels is Ford's car. Ford and his driver, or his mechanic, Spider Huff, who both of the mechanic, they were two-person cars. It took two people to drive these things. So the mechanic usually stood on the running board, and the driver actually drove and worked the steering wheel. You can see the grandstands in the background. The grandstands seat 5,000 people. They had 8,000 people on the day of the race.
Population of Grosse Pointe Park is 12,000, we're moving 12,000.
There were actually 3 races that day. So I tried to reconstruct what some of the other vehicles of the day may have looked like. In this picture, I won't try to point them out, but there's a 1901 Oldsmobile in here. There's a Toledo Steamer in here. There's a Baker Electric, which is specifically mentioned as having won one of the races. And what else have I got in there?
William K. Vanderbilt had an entry, but it's scratched.
Alexander Whitten had 2 entries, but one of them didn't make it. There were actually, in the race with Ford and Whitten, there were actually 23 cars entered, but only 2 of them actually made it to the starting line.
The flagpole is exactly as crude as you come across Continental. That's what the flagpole is.
These are my animations. I do have a slideshow of some of the things that went into the making of this project. Are you interested in seeing that, or would you rather see the animations again? Somebody make a decision. See the slides. Okay. The purpose was to recreate the driving club on the day of the race, October 10th, 1901. One thing I should tell you right now is that we know it was a cloudy day, but I have done it as if it were a brightly sunny day. The purpose for that is because in rendering 3D graphics, you need to know where the light source is. In a cloudy day, the light is basically coming from everywhere. So my computers were not powerful enough to do that, so I pretended it was a sunny day. This is, on the right is my reconstruction. You saw the animation a few minutes ago. On the left is information provided by Nick. It looks like a survey map. So this gives us the location of the track. knowing the size of the track and knowing how it was shaped and so on, knowing where the corner of it is tells us where everything else is. So that's why we know that the entryway is exactly where Algonquin is today. This is one of my primary sources for the layout of the track. This layout gives me the locations of all the buildings on the track and their relative sizes to each other and their relationship to each other. My second primary source was this. You've seen both of these in the rooms today. This was from a newspaper. It's an overhead view of the track. So between those two, that told me just about everything I needed to know about the overall shape of the track. This is the main gate. It was on Jefferson Avenue right at Algonquin. It was three arches. I've speculated that it was red there. We have a black and white photograph which you've seen out there. It clearly shows it as being brick, but I don't know what exact color it was. I did red because it looked best to me.
Stephen, I want to add too, that this design was by Mortimer Smith. Mortimer Smith, that company today is called the Smith Group. His father was Sheldon Smith, an established Smith architecture firm during the Civil War in the 1860s. Smith, Hinchman, and Grill succeeded this. This was the last design submitted by Mortimer Smith before he died in 1896. This is a Smith Group history.
Thank you. There were two ticket booths down in the front there. Iron gates to close the track during the off-season. The clubhouse, there's actually, I think, one drawing of the clubhouse that you see reproduced over and over and over again. These are two of those. Between the two of them, I was able to figure out pretty much what it looked like on the front. There is a written description of the clubhouse that I used for reference that told me in words what it looked like from the other side. So in the fly-through we saw a minute ago, the back side was pretty much speculation, but based on written descriptions. Again, I assumed that simply because everything else I assumed was brick too. When you guys make your own, you can do it different. This is the grandstands. As I said, the grandstands held 1,000 people. 5,000 people. There was a veranda on the back side. You could see the arch on the right there. A promenade where people could come down and look into the betting ring without actually having to get down there with everybody. So, and there was also refreshment stands and so on. The judging stands. One thing about the Detroit Driving Club was the finish line was closer to the clubhouse turn than was normal. It was considered an innovation, and it was copying better known racetracks in both Windsor and Lansing. So one of the finish line is more than halfway between the center point of the track and the clubhouse turn. But that places it right squarely in front of the grandstand. The barns, a lot of speculation went into the barns. People somehow don't realize how important it is to preserve details like barns. We've got pictures of the clubhouse, but why didn't they just give us a picture of the barn? It helped me so much. But as I said, there is a description about how the horses were handled, the size of the stalls and so on. That gave me a very good idea of how big the barn was. And we've got this one, you saw this earlier, this one aerial photo that gave me a hint of what the roof is like. There's one photo that exists of the race, and this is it at the bottom here. So I tried to recreate that. I placed this as just going into the clubhouse turn. I don't know if that's true or not. We do know that Whitman started developing car trouble in the 7th lap, and Ford passed him right in the middle of the front straight on the 8th lap. So I'm assuming that Whitman is starting to have car trouble. Ford is gaining on him. One more lap and he'll pass him. And I chose that point because in the picture at the bottom, you can see that we're starting to go, the railing is obviously curved there. So we're on a curve, But in the background, you can see the backstretch. There's no grandstands, there's no clubhouse or anything, so we know we're looking across to the back of the track. And there's a hint of a pond just on the right side of the picture. So it was my guess they were coming into the clubhouse turn, but I could be wrong. Nah. This is the Ford car. The Ford car was known as the sweepstakes. It was, can you help me, John? It was 589 cubic inches. It was a huge engine. It was more than 500 cubic inches, but it was 2 cylinders, 7-inch wide by 7-inch bore for that. There are many photographs and drawings and so on of the Ford sweepstakes vehicle. 2 reconstructions of it have been made. One is in the Henry Ford Museum, and one is in the Henry Ford Estate in Dearborn. We were allowed to go down and spend a few hours examining the car, photographing it. They took the panels off, so I'm very, very confident in the way the sweepstakes look. I'm less confident in the way the Winton car look. The Winton car is known as the heavy racer. Somehow we don't remember the losers in life. And I shouldn't be calling Winton a loser because he was a well-known race car driver. His vehicles were... He was a successful manufacturer as well. He ran his own car company. There were 4 copies of this vehicle made. One of them still exists, and it's in the Lawrence Anderson Museum in Boston. And I was able to contact someone who put me in touch with someone who got me in touch with someone who had actually drawn a picture of the car. Networking is everything in this business. You gotta know people. So my thanks to DJ Stewart for allowing me to use his illustration as a reference. The other vehicles that I was able to reproduce in the race, I tried to give a flavor. So at the top you see a photograph of vehicles at the Detroit Driving Club. I don't know if that was the day of the race or if it was another event. They did run car racing there until 1905, so this could easily have been another race. But you see, the dirt track you're seeing is the lane that leads from the stable area to the paddock. The track itself is on the left, and you just see a little hint of in the top photo there, a hint of the rail with someone standing next to it. So I placed a bunch of vehicles from 1901. I tried to use original research as much as I could, going back to materials from the time period. Whenever I couldn't, I used museum replicates, and I'll tell you why. At the top, you see a photograph from the period of a 1901 Oldsmobile. At the bottom is a reconstruction. Notice the wheels here are wire, and those are wood. So reconstructions very often aren't as accurate as we would like them to be. And I've discovered that it's not uncommon for auto restorers to use motorcycle wheels when trying to do the wheels. So I used source materials as much as I could, and I trusted museums more than private restorers. The Streetcar Scene, as I said before, I guessed on the buildings. I imagine there was a building there, or some sort of waiting room or something. But the streetcars are relatively accurate. The colors I don't know, but I do know that buses in Detroit were always red and white, way back. So I assume the streetcars were too. There was also a dock on the Detroit River for ferry boats to ride. This is specifically mentioned in descriptions of the course. The dock at the head of the boulevard between Jefferson Avenue and the river. I've made a generic ferry boat there based on wheelboats. The boat at the top is the Pleasance. It had a 12-foot draft and fully loaded, so I imagine it had no trouble coming up to the edge of the river. I put a lot of things into this scene for flavor, vehicles and people, various kinds of horses and so on. And I just wanted to do a montage of some of the resource material I've got. There's a lot of stuff on the internet, a lot of stuff from my own collection. One of my primary sources was the 1908 Sears Roebuck catalog, which has everything in it, from horse harness to buggies to wheelbarrows to shoes to hats to clothes to go. These are the buildings I have the least confidence in. The top one is the Tackman's house. We know there was a Tackman's house on the grounds. We know how big it was and what its shape was, but that's all we know. So I based this on my house, which was built in 1895. So my house isn't brick though. Just below that is the secretary's house. We know there was a secretary's house right next to the main gate. The ground floor was offices. There was a veranda at the top, and the second floor was the family quarters for the house. So based on what I see in the archway and in the grandstands, I made a Georgian-style house, which seems to match the architecture. But again, I guessed on that. There was a power plant on the grounds that may have also been a pump house to control the level of the ponds. And that was based on the power plant at Michigan State University, which was built in 1922, I believe. And the pedestrian bridge, we know there was a pedestrian bridge that connected the streetcar line to the main track. We know that it was 3 arches that went over the boulevard, one arch over the track, the railroad tracks, one over the boulevard, and a 3rd arch into the grounds. And that's all we know about it. So I made it look as much like the main entryway as I could and still be an arched. And finally, I want to give credit where credit is due. Nick Sinacori was the principal researcher of most of the material that he presented tonight. Showed up into this. He provided a lot of material. I'll tell you, this man is fascinating to have lunch with. If you enjoyed tonight's talk, it was this, and besides he pays too. So. John Sanderson, who's to my left, if you turn around, you'll see him. Was the automotive historian who gave me a great deal of information about what the vehicles looked like, what it was like to race in those days, and so on. 2 of my students were involved in the early stages. We did a great deal of prototyping. This model has more than 1 million data points in it, and it took us a long time to figure out how to make a model this level of detail with only 1 million points in it. So my 2 students, Mike Sitsu and Rick Gao, helped a lot on that. I also want to thank Chris Jablonski from Henry Ford Estates, who gave us access to the speech text car. I've already mentioned BJ Stewart, who helped me with research on the Lincoln car. And finally, I want to thank Schoolcraft College and especially Thomas Ford for the networking. When this project this started a year ago, it just got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And by the time we were finished, we had 20 computers all hooked together running simultaneously. And Thomas Ford was the hooker-upper guy who got all that working. And so the last 3 weeks, I've been calling him up and saying, Tom, he's been saying, I'll be right there, Steve. So I told him I'd thank him for that. Does anyone have questions? Maybe we can bring the lights up?
Yep. Switch is right there on the center door. Thank you. Questions? Raise your hand.
Thanks, Stephen. Kathy?
I am wondering if you know from satellite or other methods what is on the water landing from the
As you saw in the graphic,
Right.
they have filled, it's been filled in, so the way the coast looks now is nowhere near the topography that existed 100 years ago. That's all filled in. I will tell you this though, if you should drive down Algonquin all the way down to the Harris Park, there is a roundabout, and that is your wharf. Everything from that point to the water is filled. So that, again, is the last vestige, like the Brick Street at Marlboro. Any other questions? Does that answer it? Okay, yes, ma'am. Why did they close the racetrack? What happened? In 1911, they ran afoul of the law. You know, such things do happen, you know. It was bad enough that the track was closed down by the Wayne County Sheriff. And from that point, to 1919, it was used as the first test track for automobile companies, such as Hutt, Chalmers, Hudson, Mosier. They used that to test their cars until the track was finally subdivided in 1919 for residential use. John?
So everything was torn down there?
Pardon?
Everything was torn down?
Everything was decimated. That clubhouse probably ended up as the chunks of concrete that you saw in the river when you were growing up as a kid. So that's what happened to it.
Could you tie in the, some of the street names to the horses?
Sure, the street names. Interesting. I'm going to take the popular notion that the street names in our area have an Indian connection. Do they, Stuart? Why not, Stuart? That's right. I'll start out with. Am I too loud back there?
No.
The streets in Indian Village: Seminole, Iroquois. The Seminole Indians, to my knowledge, were in Florida. The Iroquois were around. But Iroquois was a multi-million-dollar horse, thoroughbred horse in the 19th century. Made lots of money, and was, I believe, ridden by a guy named Isaac Murphy. I'm going to tie that in too. Most of the jockeys, and jockey was a slang term. You did not call these men jockeys. That's disparaging. You called them riders. That was, in horsemen's parlance, the courtesy. They were riders. The gentlemen that were in harness racing were called drivers, thus the Detroit Driving Club / Grosse Pointe Racetrack. Both are interchangeable. Both mean the same thing. Grosse Pointe, Racecourse, Detroit Driving Club. The Detroit Driving Club was an organization. And the name went on the facade, but both names are applicable. The jockeys were African American. All the jockeys were African American until 1908. Isaac Murphy made $30,000 in 1890. That's a lot of money. Does anybody know anything about Isaac Murphy? Anybody hear about Isaac Murphy? Isaac Murphy was the super athlete of the day, before Jack Johnson, in 1912. He made a lot of money. He raced here. There's nothing to identify that. Nothing. And there should be. Along with a marker that should be at Algonquin and Jefferson identifying this racetrack, there should be a marker identifying the African American jockeys. They did it. They were there. Yes, sir.
You mentioned two streets that I once lived on, Bewick and Veneto. Do you know who they were?
Charles Bewick was in the shipping industry, and Veneto was a landowner of the area. Charles Bewick, his property started at the waterworks, went all the way up to Mass.
Is that where Beaver is?
That's where Bewick is, and there's a marker that says it's just north of the waterworks. At the waterworks, at that point, Bewick starts. And there's a marker that says historic village, so they know some of them. So getting back once again to the street names, if I may. Navajo, Navahoe. That's a horse. 1902, thoroughbred winner. Tennessee, that's our connection to Tennessee and Fairview, Tennessee. Tennessee was a gelding mare, racehorse, won a lot of races. Waterloo is a racehorse. Not the battle of Napoleon. I'm so sorry. I am so sorry. Algonquin was a racehorse. Marlborough was a racehorse. Piper was a landowner. He was a landowner, a real estate speculator. Avondale is a horse farm in Tennessee. Haverhill's for the Avery family. Copland is Charlotte Campo Copeland. Copland is a bastardization of the name Copeland. East Lawn is the east lawn of the track, where the horses come in the winter circle. The east lawn of the track. Morningside, Sunnyside. These are racetrack. This is in racetrack vernacular. Kercheval. And in one book of the Grosse Pointes, it says Kercheval is called the way of the horse. Ker Cheval. Ker Cheval. Benjamin Kercheval was a vice president of the Peninsula Bank. He was the brother-in-law of Moses Field. Mary Field was the sister of Benjamin Kercheval. So they actually have a connection. It really means something. Essex, Terraplane Hudson. Scripps Booth Automobile Company. The Scripps family, the old Detroit News. That was Scripps. Newport, Belgium. Belgian seacoast town. But the original name of Newport was Coffin. Ooh! We know who Coffin is, don't we? Howard Coffin from the Hudson Motor Car Company. Howard Dyer is a big landowner, had property in the same area. Garland, the huge stove. And we have Garland Street. There you go. But we have streets on the other side of Jefferson at that point. Marquette. Father Marquette, right? Sure, yeah. Racecourse. Meadowbrook. Oh, that's the estate of the Dodges out there in Oakland County, right? Meadowbrook was a racehorse, and the Dodge brothers were in the racehorses too. Lakewood, Ohio is where Alexander Winton came from, outside of Cleveland. Chalmers Motor Car Company. So you see the tie-in? The tie-in is with horses and cars. 3 Mile Drive. I've heard a couple explanations for this. 3 miles to the lake, 3 miles to I-94. Three 1 mile tracks. 3 1 mile tracks. Kensington is a racetrack. Bishop is for Bishop Borges. Catholic bishop who had a house at Bishop's Lane. His house was there. He had another house on Parkview too. And Casper Borges liked the ponies too, folks. Because his house was within walking distance of the old Hamtramck racetrack.
What was the name of the property that was behind the Fisher estate after it crossed?
Grayhaven. You're talking about Grayhaven? Edward Gray, and he was an engineer for Ford Motor Company. He bought that property from DJ Campo. How much did he, what was it, $10,000? $124,000? What's that to Mr. Campo? $124,000, and Gray bought what? That he drained and went broke. Now that's where the Fisher estate, where Larry Fisher built his home, one of the Fisher brothers. Lawrence Fisher was responsible for styling the General Motors by hiring Harley Earl. Well, I'm off on another tangent. But there's a tie-in with automobiles in the area. Okay? Yes, sir?
What was Bill Metzger's role in the race?
Right. Bill Metzger was an ace promoter, a super salesman. He was the premier dealer of Columbia Motor Cars, Wintons. He sold Wintons. He approached DJ Campo. He said, I have a novel idea. Why don't you have an exhibition of a race between your guy here in Detroit and Alexander Winton? Why don't we do it? Why don't we have him bid it? And Metzger brokered it. Am I right, Mike? Mm-hmm. That's what he did. He sold bicycles before that and sold cars, and Bill Metzger was an ace. I mean, the modern salesman, automobile salesman, has a debt of gratitude to Mr. Metzger.
He had the first dealership.
That's right. I have another celebrity, too. Can I do this?
Sarah Ralph.
Can I do this?
Yes, come on, Sarah, stand up.
Mike does it to you all the time.
I do. Granddaughter of Alexander Malcolmson.
Mike, you correct me if I'm wrong, because you're the man.
No.
All right? Ford Motor Company, the car that Ford drove in this race was owned by the Detroit Automobile Company. So he borrowed it. He designed it, but he borrowed it. Technically speaking, he didn't own it. Right, Mike? Okay. So he raced the car. But if it weren't for Alexander Malcolmson, and Sarah is the granddaughter of that gentleman, hotter than sunshine. The coal company, hotter than sunshine. Malcolmson was in the crowd the day of that race. And Malcolmson asked Mr. Ford if he was interested in going into business. Mr. Malcolmson staked Ford, along with John Gray,
His uncle.
and established the modern-day Ford Motor Company in June of 1903.
And I always like to say Sarah's grandfather sold out in 1906 for $175,000.
Don't do that.
If he stayed, no, if he had, well, he was still the biggest coal dealer in Detroit, but if he'd stayed till 1919 when Mr. Ford bought the rest of the stockholders,
Right.
he would have gotten $65 million, and I wouldn't know Sarah today.
But, see, we have a lot of local connection. We are connected. This is a history, for 200 years,